I just want to thank you and Joanne for inviting me here, and it's really an honor and a privilege to speak on behalf of the Society. We are used to people coming to us, so this is a rare occasion when we get to bring Abigail's story to all of you. So again, thank you. As Joanne said, I've been involved with the Society for a little over 20 years. And I like to tell the story of how and when I became involved, because it also talks about how the Society has changed. So when I was first asked to be a docent, I said, I really don't know much about Abigail. I said, I love history, but I really don't know much about her life. And I was told, don't worry about that. We don't talk about her. So that was my first introduction, and it was very much an old house tour. Let's talk about the house, not even really the people who lived in the house, but the house and the things in the house, and how a house was used and lived in the 17th and 18th centuries. I like to think when I came on the board and a few other women, we started to change that. And interestingly enough, met with great resistance to that, to begin talking about Abigail. And fortunately, over the years, that has changed. And she is the sole focus of the house, because she is the reason that the home was saved and preserved all of these many years. The slide that you see is a picture of the home as it has been restored to today. And this is the place where Abigail was born. She was raised. She was courted here by John Adams, married from this home, and where she kept coming back to visit her family. So this home wasn't just a birthplace, it's really a homestead for her and her family. So just give you that little piece of background. The Society was founded in 1947 to actually save the house. The house is not on its original location. It's actually been moved a couple of times. And the site that it's on now is probably property that her father, the Reverend William Smith, did own at one time. And it was moved here in 1947 and restored to what you see today. So it was just an amazing time in history that this was recognized as her home. Just, when you think about it, just after the women's movement, after the suffragist movement, that women banded together to save this house in Weymouth. I also have an interesting connection to the house, and I'm not from Weymouth originally. I grew up in the South and on the North Shore, and after I was married, my husband, who was from Maine, moved to Weymouth, and we actually moved to North Weymouth and specifically, and we were riding our bikes in the old cemetery, and as we were going through the cemetery, we saw a whole section of old stones from the 16 and 1700s with the Torrey name on them. And it piqued Doug's interest, and he was able to go to the local library, where Weymouth has a fine genealogy collection, and in 2 nights traces genealogy back to the Captain William Torrey, who was one of the founders of Weymouth. But interestingly, his son, the Reverend Samuel Torrey, is the person who had Abigail's home built in 1685. So I just think it's interesting. We moved to Weymouth not knowing anything about it. Actually, I was horrified that I was going to have to live on the South Shore and not the North Shore. And then I wind up working in a home that his family built so many hundreds of years ago. And so it's a fun, interesting little connection that we have. And it's such an honor to be there because of really who lived in the home, because of Abigail. just to let everyone know, if Abigail Adams was the wife of our second president, John Adams, and the mother of John Quincy Adams, our sixth president. And the only other woman who shares that distinction who recently passed away is Barbara Bush. So we had a connection there, and it was on my last day of my presidency, I went to pick up the mail for the last time, and I see this little envelope peeking out saying B. Bush, and something I had worked on through my tenure as president to make sure she became a member of the society. And she did. She had become a lifelong member of the society. So we were just very pleased that she recognized that and that place in history. The reason we know so much about Abigail is because of her writings, her correspondence. And Abigail began her correspondence with John when she was about 17 years old. They began courting, and because John lived in Braintree and Abigail lived in Weymouth, they didn't see one another every day. So they wrote letters to each other. And it is in these great letters that have been saved and preserved by the Adams family that we know so much about her and John, their relationship, and about the people and of that time, the formation of our country, the American Revolution. And when you think about how many letters she wrote and how many have been preserved, how many more perhaps we don't have, it's pretty amazing. So if you are interested, one of our references, and I'll be using this for reading some excerpts from the letters, is a collection of Abigail's letters. So this is it's a pretty thick book that has all of the letters that she wrote, and written with her misspellings and grammar that was particular to the period and the time. And I think one of the things about that, that David McCullough always says, when you read the letters, make sure you read them, keeping that in mind, their style of speaking and their grammar. And it gives you a sense of what the dialect was like, and perhaps even what accents might have been like in that period. So often when you see her letters represented, even recopied, you will see what we think of as misspellings and incorrect grammar or punctuation. I think the importance of that too is that there weren't dictionaries at that time, so they weren't looking things up. The other great thing in Abigail's letters are quotes, and quotes that she had uses from the Bible, from literature of the day, from Shakespeare, and they're not quite exact. And I think what that means is Abigail had all of these things memorized. She was writing these quotes from memory, and they were all just ways of relating to whoever the writer was. And it just, I think, shows the vast intellect and mind of this amazing woman that we so revere today. Joanne, I'll have you. Joanne's going to flip slides for me. The etching on here is a copy of Abigail's father, of the Reverend William Smith. Abigail came from a religious family. Her father was the minister of the First Church in Weymouth, which is a congregational church, still a congregational church to this day, which is somewhat unusual. Many congregational churches after the Great Awakening kind of shifted over to become Unitarian churches. So this church was founded in 1623, is still an active congregation to this day. So the Reverend William Smith was the longest serving minister of the First Church, serving 49 years. The minister was well loved in the community, but not only did he act as a minister, but he also would have been a mediator of disputes amongst parishioners and members of the community. His role was that of tutor as well. So a minister was responsible for tutoring the boys who were going to Harvard. So any students who were studying for the ministry, for the law, or for medicine would have first come to the minister's home for their education. And because this was a home of education, Abigail and her sisters received their education in the home. Reverend Smith had one of the largest libraries in the area, and we know that people traveled throughout New England to use his resources of theology books, history, science, anything that would have been popular and necessary at that time. Abigail had two sisters, an older sister, Mary, a younger sister, Elizabeth, who was known as Betsy, and a younger brother, William. The girls were not educated in the dame schools that you hear about at the time, but they were educated in the home. The interesting piece about Reverend Smith is he came from a very wealthy Charlestown family. So there was money from his family. And Abigail's mother was Elizabeth Quincy. So the Quincy's of, we say Wollaston, which is now Quincy, part of Quincy, but the Dorothy Quincy family, Elizabeth Quincy, Abigail's mother, was very well-to-do as well. But as a minister, it certainly wasn't appropriate for the Reverend Smith to show that kind of wealth. And so we look at that purchasing books was very expensive, and that his money was put into his library collection. Interestingly, there's a letter that John Adams writes about Reverend Smith saying that it's actually not very flattering, and John says that the Reverend Smith tried to conceal his wealth and hide it from his parishioners. But John goes on to say, so that his parishioners would give him things. So there wasn't a very flattering look of Reverend Smith by Abigail's soon-to-be husband. There's also that Abigail's parents weren't too fond of John, in that John was a lawyer, and we think part of that may have been that lawyers rode the circuit, and they weren't always home. So the circuit went as far as Western Mass, and then Maine was part of Massachusetts, so it was quite a broad area, and lawyers would have been gone for long periods of time, staying in homes and taverns. So there's that little bit of unsavoriness that went along with that role. But after a courtship of 3 years, John and Abigail were married just before her 20th birthday in 1764. And from there, they went to their new home. At the time, Braintree, now the birthplace homes are located in Quincy. So the sketch here is based on a small sketch that Abigail's cousin, Isaac Smith, did for Abigail's father as a gift. As you can see, and I'm going to point this out, this section of the house is the original house. This was an addition that was put on when Abigail was 16. And the large addition would have accommodated the guests and visitors to the home who came there. But the addition was not very well built. It was put on around 1760. By 1838, the addition was falling apart and it was dismantled. And so the section of the house that you saw on the first slide was moved about a mile down the street where it sat from 1838 to 1947. And then the house was moved to the current location. The house has always been identified as Abigail's birthplace, and so that we are able to, continue telling that story and sharing that legacy that is hers. And the next slide is of Amy Hill Duncan. And Amy Hill played a significant role in the preservation of the birthplace. When the house, in 1947, the house had fallen into great disrepair. And Amy Hill gathered a group of townspeople, mostly women, to save the home. And it was through her efforts that we have the house today. Interestingly, she worked with doing a penny campaign. Every store, every place in Weymouth that she could, that would take a bucket, they were put there, and pennies, literally pennies, were raised to save the house. What's interesting is Amy Hill's daughter and granddaughter came to visit us a number of years ago, and they were talking about that movement and what it was like to live in the house and just to be consumed by Abigail and all things Abigail. Amy Hill Duncan was an activist, and she was a writer for the Globe. But once the house was moved and the society was formed, Amy Hill was ousted from her position as president and really became an outsider. And it's interesting because I think it reflects on what was going on at that time, in how the board members were trying to decide how the house would be portrayed. In talking with her family, Amy was looking at the Smiths as people who had money, and that perhaps the house would have been a little finer than just a simple farmhouse. And Amy Hill wanted to bring in nice pieces of furniture and a way to show that this family, the Smith family, when they lived here, would have had finer things. And the board was very resistant to it. And it's just my assessment from living in Weymouth. I think there was that, Weymouth sees itself often as a blue-collar working class community, and there really wouldn't be anyone who was wealthy living here. And so I think that affected how the house was displayed. And for many years, it was just considered a farmhouse, just even though the people who lived there were more than just farmers, obviously. In our interpretation today, most of the things that were purchased or given to the society we have in storage because they don't really tell the story of Abigail and her family when they lived here. So that's very important to us that we tell an authentic story. As one of the things that Amy Hill did when she founded the society was to contract with one of the foremost 18th century restoration architects of the day out of Boston. His name was Frank Shoto Brown. And he came up with the plans for the restoration of the project, of the house project, and then promptly died before he could execute that. And then a local artist, watercolor artist, and contractor and architect, Carol Bill, completed the project for the society. But it's through people wanting to be authentic and accurate that we have the house as it is today. I was talking a little bit with Martha that when we did some restoration work in 2012, we appeared before the architectural board of the state so that we could get a waiver for exceptions to making the house completely handicap accessible. It's limited in that we're not taking people upstairs to the bedrooms, but it also has allowed us to keep the house show it in case in an authentic way. So that's a little aside. We have put in a ramp so people can get in with wheelchairs, but we make sure that we tell the story through looking at the house. Oh, thank you. So then the next two slides are the house being moved to the present location. And in order to be moved the second time from Bridge Street, the house had to be cut in half. So the house was cut in half and then it was put back together. So because fundraising, as I said, was literally done with pennies. This is before grants and big foundations. The board spent 10 years restoring the home to pretty much what you see today. I think a labor of real love and effort and energy by many, many volunteers. And the home is still taken care of by all. It's an all-volunteer staff and board that does this. So just in 2012, I'll speak highly. I don't know if Mashpee has community preservation funds, but Weymouth has the passed the Community Preservation Act. And it is through that source that we were able to do an assessment of our home with a historical architect, and then to do some much needed restoration work over a 2-year period. We're still involved with the Community Preservation Act in that we've now put in heat and an HVAC system in the house so that we can keep the temperature current at one setting, which helps you preserve your wood, your floors, and the few artifacts that we have. It also enables us to use the home year-round, which we do. Even though our tour season is from April to November, this allows us to bring groups in and people in who want to see the house in a private manner. And so we have made it accessible because of that. So I can't say enough about the Community Preservation Act. The portrait you see is a copy, is the property of the Mass Historical Society. We have a picture in the house that was a pastel of Abigail based on this portrait. This was done of Abigail in about 1766, 2 years after she and John were married in Salem by Benjamin Blythe. So it shows, I think, a very graceful, intelligent woman, that high forehead, those, I think, beautiful eyes that just look out to the world. But this was it's often called a wedding portrait, even though it was done 2 years after they were married. She had already had John Quincy, and we have, as I say, a copy in the house so that we can talk about who she is. As I mentioned, we know Abigail through her writings, and at one of the periods I just wanted to look at a little bit with you is from 1775 until March of 1776. And it was in this time that Abigail was actually a great recorder of what was happening in Boston and in the South Shore area of Massachusetts. So she begins, we have the Battle of Lexington and Concord in April of 1775. And then in May, there's a little skirmish off the coast of Weymouth in Hingham Harbor. It's referred to as the Grape Island Alarm. And in it there was, hay was on the island. It was stored for animals, and the colonists were afraid that the British would get a hold of it, so they burned it. And Abigail has written the only eyewitness account to that. And she sent that to John. He was in Philadelphia with the Continental Congress. And it's because of her letters that we know what happened there. And it was through her letters that John was able to convey to the Congress what was happening in Boston. Boston at this time was in a blockade by the British. And so her letter writing gave that real fervent telling of what it was like to be under house arrest, really, because the British could do whatever they wanted. In June of 1775, we have the Battle of Bunker Hill. And Abigail was in Quincy at the time, or Braintree, now Quincy, and walked up the hill, it's called Penn's Hill, and watched the Battle of Bunker Hill. And it was there that she found out that their good friend Dr. Warren had been killed. Dr. Warren was leading, one of the leaders of the American Revolution at that time. And her letter that day to John begins that decisive day, and just pouring out her heart over the loss of their dear friend and his patriotism. This is a trying time in the life of a young woman who's separated from her husband. In August, Abigail writes to John again. He's in Philadelphia, telling him about the death of his brother Elihu. In September, dysentery and sickness takes over in Weymouth, and people are dying. Abigail's own family becomes sick. She's at the home in Weymouth, and her mother is taking care of all of them. By the end of September, Abigail's mother, Elizabeth, becomes ill. And on October 1st, 1775, Abigail's mother dies. And just a portion of that letter, it conveys so much about Abigail and who she is, and about her faith and where her strength comes from. She begins her letter, have pity upon me, O thou my beloved, for the hand of God presseth me sore. How can I tell you, O my bursting heart, that my dear mother has left me? This day about 5 o'clock she left this world for an infinitely better. She goes on to tell John, I know you are a sincere and hearty mourner with me, and will pray for me in my affliction. My poor father, like a firm believer and a good Christian, sets before his children the best of examples of patience and submission. So she sends this letter to John. He won't receive it for about 3 weeks, and then she has to wait another 3 weeks for a reply. So, no immediacy that we have today with internet and telephones, and it's just that painful waiting. And she's waiting for the response that she knows she'll get from her dearest friend. in October, she writes to John and says to him, "We've been married for 12 years, and only 6 of them have we been together." So you begin to get a sense of this woman as, as a patriot, that she's really sacrificing her husband, giving up her time with him for the public good. And she understands that, and from a very early age, and wants that to happen. In November, there's sickness again in Weymouth and the surrounding area. And she begins in her writing to comment on the government that John is working on and what they're doing in Philadelphia. And all this time, be mindful that Boston's blockaded, that there's people can't get in and out of the city. And that the British, when they're in their home in Quincy, the British just march by and they go in and out of people's homes, take whatever they want or need. In December, John comes home for Christmas. Not like Christmas we celebrate. Christmas was a day of prayers and being in church. It wasn't but it was a time that they were able to be together for a short while. And then John returns to Philadelphia. And then, I want to bring you into early March, Abigail writes to John about the propaganda, thinking about where we are in terms of politics today, but of what the British are doing to destroy the reputation of John Adams and John Hancock, who's president of the Continental Congress. And she writes, "I should not mention so idle a report, but that it had given uneasiness to some of your friends, not that they in the least credited the report, but because the gaping vulgar swallowed the story." So what happened was the British put out that John Adams and John Hancock had fled the Continental Congress on a ship out of New York and were heading to London for refuge. So these 2 great patriots were having their names slandered. That was not the only way that the British sought to slander the patriots. They it's saying the letters that traveled, if any letters were confiscated, they were often published in the local newspapers. And John, being the bold and critical person that he could be, often wrote about other members in the Continental Congress in not very flattering ways. So some of those letters were published, and that meaning that John had to kind of backtrack and make amends with the people that he was trying to work with in the Congress. So that honesty could also get him in great trouble. Then a little later, at the end of the month, Abigail writes perhaps what we think of as one of her best known letters is "Remember the Ladies." So it's at this time that Abigail and John have been corresponding. He's telling her what's going on in the Congress, what they're doing, how they're trying to form a way to separate. And she's thinking about all of these ideas and ideals that are being put forth. And so she writes, "I long to hear that you have declared an independency. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. So I think it is in that letter that Abigail really conveys to John what she is thinking. For those of you who don't know, John and Abigail were the only two early presidents who did not own slaves. John and Abigail were abolitionists. They did not support slavery. They did not own slaves. And yet they did benefit, as I say, from the slave culture that was in New England at that time. And so part of in Abigail's letter, that letter, she's also writing about slavery, and that this, as you create this new nation, the slaves also need to be freed. So, but what's interesting is that Abigail's father, and as we've recently learned, grandfather and great-grandfather were slave owners. So here you have the congregational minister owning people and being able to determine their fate, where they would live, and how they would live. So we know a little bit about Phoebe, who was one of the women slaves, and that because she eventually went to live at Abigail's home after she was freed, and when Abigail went to Europe, Phoebe was the person she entrusted her home to, not her sisters, Mary, who lived in Braintree, and Betsy, who was up in Haverhill, but to Phoebe. She was the woman who would take care of the home for the 4 years that Abigail was in Europe. So this is a portion of Abigail's father's will, leaving Phoebe, interestingly, to either Mary or Elizabeth. Abigail is not mentioned, or giving her freedom. And Phoebe chose freedom. So I think one of the things that has been difficult for all of us is the acknowledgement of slavery in New England. And as we work with other historical societies and organizations and scholars, we are starting to come to terms with that. And as I said, even though John and Abigail did not own slaves, they benefited from that, as I say, that slave culture of enslaved people. And in one way, when John and Abigail were courting one another, John was inoculated with the smallpox virus, but he was still writing letters to Abigail. So her father's slave, Tom, was the transporter of those letters. So that meant Tom was being exposed to the virus, going back and forth between the household in Weymouth and Boston. So it gives us pause, and actually I'll just put in a little plug for this Friday night. We have one of our the scholars that we work with, Karima Lewis, who's been doing a lot of research on slavery in the South Shore, and particularly in the Smith household. She'll be giving a lecture at the Church of the Presidents in Quincy at 7 o'clock. So I'll just put that out there. So this next slide is a picture of the kitchen in the house. And this was the women's domain. And this is where Abigail and her sisters would have learned how to run a household and manage a household. And as I shift a little bit, I keep this in mind. This is where Abigail is coming from. The homes that she moved to in Quincy, the two birthplace homes that are on Franklin Street, are very similar to the home that she grew up in. So in June of 1784, this is after the American Revolution, Abigail leaves Boston. Abigail and her daughter, Abigail, also known as Nabby, leave for Boston. And they're going to first stop in London for a brief stay and then on to Paris, where John is serving in the new government. It is here in Paris that Abigail becomes friendly with Thomas Jefferson. It's here in her letters that you see that strong moral standing of, oh my gosh, look at what the French do and the way they behave. She was not pleased. She was very dismayed in Benjamin Franklin and his manner of familiarity with French women. And so it was here that she really, she turned to Tom Jefferson, and it's where their friendship began. And she and John, even though Jefferson and Adams had disagreements about the government, they formed a good friendship here. The basis for friendship was formed here. They were in Paris for about a year, and then in 1785, John and Abigail departed for London, where John was going to be the first ambassador to the Court of St. James. So here they were going to go back to the king that they had written, that the colonists, now Americans, had written about, who they had broken off relationship from, to now they're going back to London to say, how do we form a relationship with our mother country? So while in London, Abigail looks for a home. Throughout this whole time, she's dismayed at how little John is compensated monetarily for the work he's going to do, and for all of the work that's expected of them as ambassadors. And at this time, you have to appear in court before the king and queen. So Abigail writes about that, and is just dismayed that you can't wear the same dress twice. Abigail was rather frugal. It is before her presentation, it's the first time John gives Abigail a pair of earrings. He gives her a pair of pearl earrings and to wear. It's really her only jewelry that she receives from him. So interestingly enough, John and Abigail both seem to like King George, and their both writings to back home to people, they indicate that. They weren't so fond of Queen Charlotte, but they did seem to like the king. Then again, in 1786, Thomas Jefferson comes from Paris and joins the Adamses in London. And it is here that Abigail's daughter, Nabby, marries William Smith. So Abigail has that joy in her life. A little later in that year, the Adamses take a trip to Holland, in which Abigail writes about that connection to, I know Plymouth is getting ready to celebrate their 400th birthday, and kind of their connection to their forefathers and foremothers. The Adams family were descendants of the Aldens. So she writes a bit about that. And then back to England in 1787, and it is here that Jefferson's daughter, Polly, arrives, and Abigail takes great joy in taking this young lady under her wings. And for about 5 or 6 weeks, Polly, this young girl, brings kind of life and light into Abigail's life. And it is Jefferson deciding to send a servant to get Polly to bring her to him that really upsets Abigail, and she writes quite harshly to him about that. And it is a little bit later when Abigail sends letters to Polly, Jefferson describes his daughter as just being basically out of her mind excited to receive a letter from Abigail. And Abigail maintains a relationship with this young woman pretty much throughout her life. And then during this time period, I think one of Abigail's happiest moments in one of her letters to her niece is summed up when she describes herself as becoming a grandmother. It's one of the few letters, or one of the few times that she actually uses an exclamation point. And she very simply says, "I write to inform you that I am a grandmama." And I think it's in her writing that we, even though we're looking at 200 years plus years ago, that we can relate to this person. That, these are real people, these were real people with real feelings and thoughts and desires and joys and sorrows that we all know in our lives today. And this family had, great joy, but also great sorrow. Abigail's son was an alcoholic. And this is all before a time when we look at alcoholism as a disease. Her daughter Nabby had breast cancer, had a double mastectomy without anesthesia, and died soon after in 1813, before, what mom wants to see her daughter pass before her. But it's in her letters, in what she writes, and the way she composes herself, that we get this real glimpse of her and how she put herself second. And I think that was part of who the Adamses were, in that they understood public service. And the family has had to live with that through many, many years of that expectation, and that you're always giving up self for somebody else. John and Abigail they did leave Europe in 1787. John resigned from his post. He was anxious to get back home, became second president after George Washington, and was horribly, bitterly defeated by his friend Thomas Jefferson. We think of today what we see out there amongst the political parties, and it was just as fierce and nasty in the beginning, and unfortunately, as it is often today. And it caused a rift, obviously, in that friendship, not only between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, but between Abigail and Jefferson. But it is later that Jefferson writes condolences and on Nabby's death, and John Adams and Abigail resume writing to Thomas Jefferson. And after that bitter defeat, John is finally able to return home to Quincy, to his beloved farm in Peacefield, where he spends the rest of his life. And Abigail by his side. And she died there in the home in 1818, and John died eight years later on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. So I take that, there's that humble beginning in Weymouth, and that woman went all the way to Europe, and was seen and met kings and queens, and then came home to enjoy enjoy her life with her family. But then not only was that sense of public service in her husband, but then we see it later in her son, John Quincy, who goes on to become the 6th president. So this is the cemetery, the Old North Cemetery in Weymouth, and the house is directly in front of the cemetery. So this is one of my favorite times of the year. And it is here in this cemetery that Abigail's parents are buried. So William Smith and Elizabeth are buried on the hill, and their stones overlook the location of the house to where we are today. So I just want to thank you for inviting me, and it's an honor to be here and always to speak about Abigail and her family. We do, I think, great work with a small board and very little funds. We are the Abigail Adams Historical Society is a small private nonprofit organization, and our task is to maintain the home as it would have looked when Abigail and her family lived there, and to tell the story and retell the story and look at new ways to tell the story of Abigail Smith Adams. So thank you.